Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Well, it's official. Canada is facing a certain federal election following the prorogation of Parliament after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his plan to resign when a new Liberal leader is chosen by the party. At the same time, Canada is facing threats of 25% tariffs from President Donald Trump, who is also saying he will use financial force to take over Canada as the 51st state. What can Canadian nonprofits do to better prepare their organizations for a potential new government and havoc in the economy that U.S. tariffs would create? Are there any steps that they can take now to insulate their operations and revenue streams from the turbulence of government uncertainty and economic impacts? To discuss these important issues, we're joined by Christopher Holz, Principal of Campbell Strategies and Government Relations Advisor for capitalW. Chris is a seasoned public affairs executive with over 20 years of experience providing counsel at all three levels of government. He's also served private sector clients, citizen groups, and charities. Previously, he served as a senior advisor to several Ontario cabinet ministers, including the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Finance, and the Chair of the Cabinet, providing his perspective on both sides of government relations. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Great to see you, Mary.
Well, it's stating the obvious that this is a time of extraordinary and quite unprecedented uncertainty in Canadian politics. I'd like to start with focusing on the latest development in Canadian federal politics, and then moving to the impact of the re-election of Donald Trump. First, can you give us an overview of the current state of affairs in federal politics from your perspective?
So that's a great question, and I'm going to try and give you a pithy answer. So for quite some time, the public opinion research has demonstrated that the Conservatives have been multiple, leagues ahead of where the Liberals are. Over the last year and a half, that's continued to grow. That's not a political statement. That's just a fact based on public opinion research. The big development over the last several months and the last several weeks, especially this week with the currency date of today's date, January the 10th, is that the Prime Minister has announced that he is stepping down. There will be a leadership race. That leadership race, the rules have been announced as of today. And will conclude in early March, which gives very little time for that new leader to set a course for the government, which will likely will fall, in fact, by the end of March, when the next confidence vote is scheduled to take place. What that means is that there will be a federal election. That election will conclude in 36, maybe to 50 days. So we're going into super overtime with a dynamic period of significant change, but also uncertainty around leadership, uncertainty around policy priorities. We know what many priorities are, candidly, but it's quite an uncertain time, no question.
Well, let's move on to the elephant in the room. We knew that there would be threats of some sort of tariffs imposed on Canadian imports to the U.S. because we've seen this movie before in President Trump's first term. But now we're looking at potentially ruinous 25% tariffs, according to his latest threats. What kind of impact would they have on Canadians, the economy, and ultimately nonprofits?
So, economists have been pretty clear that there will be significant impacts to the Canadian economy, jobs. The economy for 2025 is going to be quite rocky, depending on how long these tariffs last. Is this process going to be a year, multiple years, or is this something that will start out on January the 20th and conclude in a few weeks' time? Nobody can really know. We really don't know the answer to that. But there are impacts for sure on business, on job creation. For charities and nonprofits, that also means that in some cases, there will be more that organizations need to do because of their mandates to support Canadians or Ontarians or British Columbians, wherever we may operate. In some cases, it may also mean a loss of revenue because governments are taking funding and dedicating it to new needs and requirements. For example, folks that have lost jobs in industry or something. So I can't predict the absolute future. But what I can say is dynamic impacts right across the board. And it's not just from a Canada perspective. Our friends in the US will also be impacted by this. Tariffs are not a one-way street. Tariffs will also be imposed by Canadians on the U.S. On U.S. Exports, and they will have a significant impact as well. There will be impacts for the United States. There's no question, but proportionally, it's going to be harder for us.
And last time we spoke, we addressed the other thing that President Trump was talking about, which was tightening up the border and getting rid of the immigrants that had crossed the U.S. border, and how that might potentially impact Canada. I wonder if you could follow up on that.
Sure. So, President Trump was pretty clear in his campaigning about cracking down the border. There have been multiple statements and commitments that he's made since being elected, not yet even in government. One of the key things if we could just go back in time looking at that campaign, almost all of it was related to the southern border of the United States, Mexico, and really immigration from Latin America through Mexico into the United States. But that's not the only thing. Clearly, Canada is also impacted. For many Canadians, that's a bit of a surprise that we would be a border issue for Americans. But what is clear is that that is an issue. Border crossings, but also drug smuggling, even though the percentage of drug smuggling is typically in the opposite direction rather than Canada to the United States. So, since all of that is a preamble, there's been a number of measures that the current federal government has implemented or has proposed, and provinces as well. So that includes a significant investment with respect to border patrols and investments in the CBSA, the RCMP, etc. Some provinces have also taken steps to implement additional border security, border monitoring, etc. That's the Ontario government, the Alberta government, and others, I think, as well, are looking to do that. So, and it's in a couple ways, just to be perfectly clear. Part of it is around trying to address some of the concerns of the new U.S. administration about folks in Canada that are looking to enter the United States irregularly. I'll use that term. But the other part of it also is there is an expectation that a number of folks in the United States that that are maybe illegal immigrants might be looking to exit the United States into Canada. And that has happened in the past. And that will be quite an impact for multiple border communities. And that's something that even charities and nonprofits, the day after, 2 days after the U.S. election, were saying that we need more investment to be able to be in a position to support these folks when they come across. Because we know it's going to happen, because it's exactly what happened 8 years ago. So back to you.
Well, the other thing I want to address before sort of exploring this whole issue of how the prorogation and how the election impacts funding, like the transfer payments, before we get to that, I'd like to ask you about just what do you make of this talk about annexing or taking over Canada? Has it gone beyond the joke, which it appeared to be originally, to something more serious? Is it a negotiation strategy, or is he just trolling us?
Look, it's not a joke. It's not a joke. I think everybody takes I think they take the damage of the flippant language quite seriously, and it's pretty unfortunate. But it's also in the same press conference where we're talking about low-flow showerheads invading Panama, invading Greenland, and doing all kinds of other things. So if you take it in that context, low-flow showerheads, economic impacts on Canada, I don't know why those things are in the same sentence, but in his mind they are. And the reality is we do need to take it seriously. I think we all are taking it seriously. The Prime Minister has been on American media. Premier Ford has been on American media. The Premier of Alberta has been we all take it very seriously. It's so unfortunate that we have to spend this amount of energy and time for what is supposed to be the best friendship that has ever existed between two countries, at least since 1812. It's a dynamic. It's something that we all take seriously. Industry does. Governments clearly do. It's a dynamic that we're going to have to ride through. And you know what? One of the advantages, I suppose, is that distraction seems to work well. While there's a mode of thought here, it may change quickly to something else. I think the hope is, look, there's friends on all sides of the border. We care about our American friends. We literally are sending planes, helicopters, firefighters to deal with what is the worst fire disaster in California. This currency date, again, January the 9th or January the 10th. Who knows what it'll be next week? But all I would simply say is, yeah, it's something we all take seriously, and it is unfortunate. But we hope that, that we can reach an agreement and reach a solution that works both for our American friends and for Canadians.
Well, I'd like to move now to, I guess, the perspective of things from the point of view of nonprofits and charities. When we last spoke, you talked about how once an election was called, there was a dead period during which there was little that nonprofits could do to build relationships with government or civil servants. But in this instance, there's a prorogation of Parliament that is sure to be followed by the federal election, as we've said. Is that dead period lengthened significantly because of the prorogation, or can nonprofits still engage with government or civil servants during prorogation? And if so, even is it worth it?
That's a great question. So when we started this discussion, we were in a different time, a different period, different year even. The things that we have been talking about are the kinds of things that, regardless of this unique period or a future election period, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, wherever it may be, I think is all current and useful. To answer your question directly, Mary, I think there's certainly an opportunity to engage with public servants. If we're talking at the federal level, absolutely there is an opportunity to do that. I think that that's very important, especially because that transition process, we can see that there will be an election. It's pretty much a guarantee unless something else unpredicted happens in the next 8 weeks. I think that that's something that charities and nonprofits ought to do. From an engagement with respect to the political parties, I would say that their platforms are largely developed now. But, I would also say that things have changed pretty dramatically. Let me give you just a simple example. For the Conservatives federally, their strategy has been to have a carbon tax election. They have been working on that for a year and a half. Everything has been focused on that. And Justin Trudeau. Well, you know what? Carbon tax is not going to be the election issue. They may that's a strategic thing for the Conservatives. That's not a criticism, but that's not really what the issue is going to be. It clearly isn't. Second thing is Justin Trudeau is not going to be around end of March, middle of March. So the reason why I'm giving you that example is to say platform stuff, there may still be an opportunity for charities and nonprofits to inject things that may help shape a particular platform. I will say the more in the context of dealing with trade, tariffs, and the impacts on the economy, the more likely it is that there will be some opportunity to integrate into a platform. So what do you mean, Chris? What I mean is we're talking about job training or supports for people who lose jobs because of sustained tariffs or illegal immigrants coming to Canada. Those areas are going to be areas where there's going to be clearly a need for some investment by government. So hint, hint, those areas are likely, whatever party, that there's going to be something there. And from a government engagement standpoint, I'm talking with the civil servants now, absolutely there's an opportunity, and I think that's important.
So if a nonprofit or charity wants to engage with a party while they're developing or polishing their platforms and mandate, and their policies, how do they go about doing that? Like, what is the best way to reach out if they've never done it before?
Yeah, great question. Time is everything, and the more of it we have, the better off we are. The longer the runway, the better. I say that, but even at this late stage, I think we look with what we've got in the boat. It's a rocky situation. It's a significant storm of uncertainty. But what I mean by that analogy is to say, if we have relationships with ministers because we have an ongoing funding relationship, if we have MPs or MLAs, if we're talking in the provincial context, where we have a relationship, it starts with who we know and who we can get to. I say that because even with the time frame that exists, as limited as it is, that would be probably the first place to go. If there was a longer period of time, there might be platform consultations and things like that, and that's certainly an opportunity. But I would say simply ministers' offices, or critics would be a mechanism to engage. If we're not at that level, at least MPs or MLAs. The generation of media coverage around an issue or a solution, especially if it's sustained, is an opportunity to build awareness of an issue, who we are as an organization, as a charity, or a network of organizations that work together, maybe in multiple jurisdictions. Those kinds of things or efforts or tactics would help to get on the agenda and maybe a series of meetings. But those are the kinds of things that I think are still available. But it is limited. It's not going to be easy. But I would also say that whatever the platform strategy was in December or late November is different now than it was before. So I think there is a refreshing of for all the parties, this is what we were planning to go on. Is this still relevant? Maybe not. So hint, hint, there's still a bit of an opportunity.
So we have spoken before about the fee-for-service model that exists in Canada in the transfer payments from the federal government to provinces that really form the largest part of the funding to nonprofits. Can you just give the audience an explanation of how important government funding is to nonprofits as far as the proportion of their revenues and how that might be impacted during uncertain times?
So, great question, Mary. So, I would simply say this: government funding in Canada from a charities perspective is probably a lot greater than it is in other countries like the United States and others. Federal funding is large as it is. It's actually provincial funding where there is a lot more funding that goes to charities and nonprofits. Why? Because charities and nonprofits often are the delivery service agents for government policy, for services to folks. Certainly governments do that, absolutely. But we actually do rely a lot on charities and nonprofits to deliver certain kinds of services. So to answer your question with respect to the level of funding that may be available post this coming election, I think it's going to be reduced. I say that because, and not across the board, but I think that the reality is because of what likely will be a change in government. That's not a political statement. That's just for what it's worth. There will probably be less funding. That trickles down to the provinces, and that trickles down to charities and nonprofits. There is likely to be new funding opportunities for some charities and nonprofits because of this changing political environment, because of this uncertainty between Canada and the U.S. So it's not a loss across the board. In some cases, there may be new funding that will be available. From a fee-for-service perspective, yeah, I can see that there may be cuts in certain areas. From a grants and contributions perspective, we can see that for some parties, let's say the Conservative Party, they've been pretty clear. Overall, their frame is, bring it home. What does that mean? It means tax cuts so that you keep more in your paycheck than goes to government to fund services that you may or may not use. That's essentially their philosophy. I'm not trying to be simplistic about it, but that is absolutely the case. So what that simply means is, yeah, there may be cuts there, but it's not across the board. And I think that for charities and nonprofits, what do we do now with this period of uncertainty? Identify new funding sources, maybe from different levels of government, but also diversifying the funding sources that we have. We just because we've done it the same way for 17 years or 10 years or whatever doesn't mean that that's the only way that works. Diversifying your fundraising really ought to be the number one priority now. And it takes some time, but it will ensure that organizations can survive this funding uncertainty and this significant change. Much more now this cycle than previous cycles, I would expect.
Well, we don't want to forget that in very recent history, i.e., 2024, that there have also been very many elections and changes in government in 2024 at the provincial level in many provinces across Canada, and those and more that are expected in 2025, including in Ontario. Now, when that might happen might have changed from what we expected in December, for example, but how impactful are those elections and potential changes in government to nonprofits and charities, dependent on the fee-for-service model that you've described?
A great question. So every election is an opportunity for change, whether it happens or not. Even the priorities of a party that continues to be successful, there's going to be an impact. From a fee-for-service perspective, for charities and nonprofits that rely on that kind of funding, there likely will be an impact, in part because of the cascading impact of federal, provincial, municipal funding relationships, and candidly, more now because of the uncertainty of this U.S.-Canada trade environment and the economic impacts of what appears to be happening. That's going to change the agenda for everybody. So that is probably a greater impact than the traditional potential change in government, because there will always be impacts on charities and nonprofits from the funding resourcing that they get. Doesn't matter if it's an NDP to Liberal government, a Conservative to an NDP government. It makes no difference. There will always be an impact, and there will be winners and losers as a result of that. Not saying losers, but yeah, that where there's funding that you were relying upon, it may not be at the magnitude that you were expecting, or maybe greater, or maybe significantly less, or maybe eliminated altogether. That's all quite possible.
You mentioned that nonprofits and charities should prepare themselves for a cut in funding based on a change in government at the federal level. But you've also, I guess, indicated the impacts on the economy, businesses, industry, that any tariffs might actually represent to our economy as a whole, which of course impacts the pocketbook of every Canadian who might be a donor. So given the circumstances, do you have any particular advice related to that when you think about diversifying the revenue sources?
That's a great question. So I think it's helpful to think of the funding pie for all charities and nonprofits. The government is a segment, and typically it's a large segment. And when we say government, we're talking about 3 levels of government. And depending on the charity, more or less is coming from one or more sources there. But we're also talking about corporates, so corporate partners that many charities do engage with for a variety of reasons, and can do so very effectively. Hint, hint. Like, that's an area that more charities and nonprofits should look to for a variety of reasons. But beyond that, family foundations, other kinds of foundations are another mechanism. And then certainly individual donors, which is the area that you're mentioning specifically. I mean, it'll impact all of them, but especially individual donors. The reality is it's hard to predict how that will flow, but I think it's helpful to think of the fundraising environment with all those segments. Not every charity is going to be successful in generating funding from all those multiples, but it's never going to be just government. And if it is, you're not going to be around for a long time, because unless you're able to continuously reframe and reorganize who you are and what you do and the services you provide, that's too much. Really, we need multiple sources of funding where we can find them, where it fits, to be able to withstand an impact maybe in the economy, allows us to maybe engage more with government, or change in government if we can support at least some funding from family foundations, corporates, perhaps maybe individual donors. That's a lot better. We're going to be a lot more. Um, we'll be able to manage what we do if we can have multiple sources of funding that we can rely on.
Right. So diversifying your sources of revenue and funding for nonprofits and charities is your primary advice. Do you have any? I mean, things are moving so quickly and changing at breakneck speed. Are there any specific strategies that you suggest to help them weather these stormy times?
So, the first thing is look at your organization, look at the changing environment. Where does the funding come from currently? If 60%, 70% of your funding comes from one source, 70% of your time better be focused on that. Or recognizing that how are you going to manage something that might change here, and how can you supplement it in other sort of buckets? So I would say the very first thing before panic is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. The first thing is figure out where your funding sources are, what may be at risk based on this environment, and figure out a plan. There's all kinds of ways to organize how a plan is developed or created, but it really does start with that. Do the homework first. What will become clear is, some of that will require some kind of government engagement. I suspect if 70% of your funding comes from two sources in government, you're going to have to focus on those two areas of government. But you also need to be mindful that some of that may change. So how can we supplement that? Maybe at the provincial level, there's an opportunity. Maybe at the municipal level, there is. But what else outside of government can we rely on, or can we look to as a new source of funding? Maybe it's a partnership with another organization that they're as good as we are, but they got a lot more profile than we do. Or, together we can build much more profile and perhaps offer something to corporates that want to partner, but also deliver some kind of impact in the communities where we operate. But we need to be very creative in how we think about dealing with, like all problems in life. We need to be creative in how we approach these things. But it absolutely starts with really figuring out a strategy and assessing what is happening in the environment and how we fit or don't fit, and then trying to pivot and then implement.
And I'd like to wrap up by, having the benefit of your expertise and perspective on things. Are there any final words that you'd like to leave for our audience in the nonprofit sector?
I think a couple things. I think, first of all, Charity Village is a great resource for charities and nonprofits across the country. I say that, but it's the truth, that there's a lot of resources that I think are available to organizations. The number one recommendation I would have is, if you have a strategy, make sure that strategy fits the context of this unique environment. Again, January the 10th, at 10:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I say that because things are changing rapidly, as you've just mentioned. So being on top of the political manifestations and changes, I think, is helpful. That can be crazy making, but understand the environment, figure out what your strategy is, and does it fit the current context? If you don't have a strategy, that's all right. Now is the time to create one. Look to where your revenue currently is coming from and what may be at risk, and identify opportunities to maybe diversify that revenue. That's going to take some time. There's all kinds of resources out there. We provide that funding service and support for organizations. Charity Village has lots of resources available too. But that's the reality of this moment. I would also just say it's not all negative. While funding may be reduced by government, especially at the federal level, there may be new funding that's available, quite candidly, because of some of the changes that we can foresee. Some of this is pretty clear, that from an immigration, irregular immigration perspective, there will be a need for more resources there. from a support for workers perspective, there will be upskilling opportunities and funding that will be needed because of some of the impacts of what is likely to happen in less than 2 weeks' time. And how long that lasts, that's an open question. But there's a lot. This year will be, appears to be very rocky. So we need to be mindful. I guess wear a helmet.
That's always good advice, but particularly in this situation. As always, Chris, it's such a pleasure speaking with you and hearing your insights on how nonprofits and charities can navigate these very, very turbulent and unexpected times of political change and economic uncertainty. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
My pleasure. Great to see you again, Mary.